Imagine living in a world where a drop of ancestry could dictate your entire life. This principle was known as the one-drop rule, a concept deeply rooted in American history, and its echoes still reverberate today in the way that we view mixed-race individuals, people like Barack Obama, Tiger Woods, and Kamala Harris. Poet Langston Hughes noted in his memoir, saying that in the U.S., a Negro was used to describe anyone with black ancestry, whereas in Africa, it referred to someone that was fully black. Well, today we're going to talk about the history of the one-drop rule. And if you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, you like this channel, find our Patreon page in the description below. But without further ado, let's get started. The one-drop rule is a social and legal principle of classification that has historical prominence in the United States. The rule asserted that a person with just one drop of African ancestry was considered black, regardless of their physical appearance. The origins and implications of this rule were deeply intertwined with history of slavery, segregation, and racial dynamics in America. This idea dates back to 1662 Virginia law that laid the groundwork for over 3 centuries of racial categorization. This law set out to meticulously dictate the social standing of mixed-race individuals. One famous historical case involves President Thomas Jefferson. DNA evidence and historical records believe that he had at least 6 mixed-race children with his enslaved concubine, Sally Hemings. Sally was predominantly white and was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife. 4 of these 6 children lived to adulthood, and even though they were mostly of European ancestry, which would have made them legally white had they been born free, Virginia's law at the time considered them to be enslaved because their mother was enslaved. In colonial America, where you fell on the racial spectrum was not just about how you looked, it determined their very existence. Dark skin, broad noses, and tightly coiled hair were more than physical attributes. They were symbols that branded you socially inferior. This crude categorization enforced a brutal hierarchy. White meant freedom, black meant enslavement, and it was fairly straightforward. But life is rarely that simple. Extensive racial mixing blurred these rigid lines of race and status. Records as early as 1630 showed these anxieties. Colonist Hugh Davis, for instance, was publicly whipped for having sexual relations with a black woman. Interracial relationships, although rampant, faced harsh punishments, and any white person caught in such an act faced public humiliations and reprisals. This mixing posed a significant problem for white supremacy at a time when, in many places, blacks outnumbered whites. There was a palpable fear among whites of losing control of their enslaved population. Therefore, keeping white supremacy pure became an obsessive goal. These white anxieties about racial mixing was tied to eugenics and scientific racism, both claiming the superiority of the white race and painting blackness as a contaminant. To protect this ideology, it was critical to keep the color lines firm and clear. Thus, miscegenation laws were born. These laws made interracial marriage and sometimes even sex a criminal act. Although these laws appeared to police interactions between different races, they primarily sought to regulate the behaviors of white people. Essentially, because blacks were already enslaved, these laws ensured that whites adhered to this manufactured boundary of racial purity. The impact of these laws well beyond human relationships. They also shaped legal definitions of race. Many people who had mixed ancestry looked white, and because they were mostly of European descent, they were considered legally white. Differing states had legal variations of what it meant to be black or white. For example, in 1822, a law in Virginia said that to be called a mulatto, a term that was borrowed from the Portuguese and the Spanish, which comes from the Latin word meaning mule, person needed to have at least 1/4 of black ancestry. The Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, Virginia made new rules limiting the freedoms of freed black people. However, they didn't establish the one-drop rule right away. In 1853, when this rule was suggested, lawmakers realized that it could negatively impact many people who were already legally considered white. Over time, however, These rules changed. By 1910, Virginia updated this law to someone who had 1/16 Black ancestry, and by 1930, any African descent at all meant that a person was legally considered Black. Contrasting with Virginia's stance on racial definition, New Orleans exhibited a more nuanced approach. New Orleans in particular has a long history of racial classification. This city had created a multi-tiered system, quite distinct from the binary classification that you would see elsewhere. Whites held the highest status, Blacks held the lowest, but in between, there was something called the Creoles of color, and they had carved out an intermediate of that precarious social status. These Creoles were the product of generations of intermixing between whites, Africans, and the indigenous people. Unlike other regions, interracial relationships were more tolerated and somewhat encouraged in colonial Louisiana. In this in-between class, Creoles functioned as a buffer, helping whites maintain their dominance while keeping unmixed Blacks firmly in their place. Creole children often received recognition and even freedoms from their white fathers. This acknowledgement allowed many Creoles to rise to positions of privilege and be ingratiated into the elite class. Within this status came a sense of superiority over Blacks, despite the fact that many of them had Black ancestry. This is where it gets even more intricate because Louisiana developed an even more intricate caste system based on fractions of Black ancestry. This is where you would see terms like quadroon, octoroon, and griffe. These were used to describe the exact portion of Black and white lineage that a person had. This granularity highlights how desperately society clung to these racial distinctions, even though the lines were incredibly blurred. After the Civil War, Southern states created laws to enforce segregation and limit the rights of Black people, stripping them of their right to vote, their political participation. Between 1890 and 1908, these laws were passed by all former Confederate states and maintained until the 1960s. This notion of the one-drop rule was crystallized in 1896 when the Supreme Court, in its infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision, this upheld the segregationist laws that established the separate but equal doctrine. This ruling triggered by the case of Homer Plessy, a man that was considered Black under Louisiana law due to him being 1/8 Black. This cemented the legal foundation for racial discrimination. Between 1910 and 1930, states like Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi adopted the one-drop rule, while other states practiced it de facto. This period was marked by legal enforcement of racial segregation and extended well into the 20th century, embedding systemic racism deeply into the fabric of American society. Fast forward to the 1940s, where individuals like Walter Pecker in Virginia and Nomi Drake in Louisiana took the one-drop rule to even further draconian measures, warping records and erasing the rich heritage of countless families. Pecker's chilling belief that there was a higher race and that race must be protected from the lessers. Pecker's Racial Integration Act, which passed in Virginia in 1924, this new law prohibited interracial marriage and ushered in a long period of racial discrimination administered by the Virginia government. Walter Pecker, as head of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, Pecker was responsible for ensuring that all infants born in Virginia received birth certificates that included their racial designation. He was an active eugenist and used bureaucracy as a weapon against Black and indigenous people all across the state. Yet, amid this tapestry of oppression, there emerged sparks of hope and resilience. The civil rights movement during the 50s and 60s started to dismantle this legal segregation and pushed against century-old barriers. The landmark 1967 Supreme Court decision in Loving v. Virginia was a watershed moment, striking down Virginia's ban on interracial marriages and the underlying prejudicial principles of Pecker's Racial Integration Act. This ruling marked a crucial victory in the fight for racial and decades of systemic discrimination and the erasure of mixed-race identity. Interestingly, the one-drop rule was not unique to the United States and did find parallels in other societies with histories of race mixing, such as Latin America. Also in Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg laws came up with a system determining who belonged to what group that was based on the one-drop rule. This allowed Nazis to criminalize marriage and sex between Jewish people and Aryans. But rather than adopting the one-drop rule, Nazis decreed that a Jewish person was anyone who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents. Even today, the remnants of the one-drop rule persist in our societal consciousness. Take, for instance, the story of Rachel Dolezal, a controversy that triggered a national debate about the authenticity of racial identity, and the 2000 census allow individuals to identify with more than one race for the first time. The history of the one-drop rule encapsulates the complexities and contradictions of America's racial history. It is a testament to the ways in which laws and social norms can crystallize racial boundaries that are essentially just social constructs. And it highlights the ongoing struggle to navigate and dismantle these rigid classifications in the pursuit of a more equitable society. Thank you. This has been One Mic Black History, and this is the story of the one-drop rule. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this on OneMicHistory.com. Also, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I'd like to thank all my Patreon subscribers. Without you, none of this could be possible. Peace.